What's up, y'all? We had a little bit of technical difficulty over here. I think that you may not have been able to hear me for a little while. I apologize for that. When we upload to YouTube and all of our streaming apps, we will have sound. But thank you for tuning in and sticking with me. But just to kind of go back to what I was talking about earlier, what I did was, I don't know if you heard any or all of it, but I was speaking about how there's a lack of trust in politics, and there's a lack of trust in our politicians because we basically keep hearing the same old rhetoric. And what I was leading into is that we have to learn how to develop trust within ourselves. And what that means is that we have to, instead of voting for the most popular guy or for, voting, for me particularly as a black woman, voting for the black woman or voting for the black man simply because, loyalty, we really have to vote with our with our morals. And this is not me like trying to persuade anyone to do anything. Obviously you all know that I'm impartial. Well, I have an affinity for Marianne Williamson, but at the same time, I have always voted according to my morals instead of just voting because of what it seemed like I should do or what society is telling me to do. And so, trust, trust is basically the ultimate root of our influence. So if we place our support behind, the clubs, or like I said, what society or, what our, according to what our perceived image is, and not according to where our moral obligations lie, then we are basically we're also subconsciously letting ourselves know that we don't trust ourselves to make a right decision. The low trust is it can potentially, what it does, it slows down the progress. Hi, Kevin. Kevin's here, you guys.
Hello, America. Hello,
He's sweating. He's sweating, poor guy. How was traffic? Was bad.
Traffic was bad, but that wasn't all that was bad.
His phone is, but he couldn't answer my call or anything, you guys. It was terrible.
No.
Well, I just fumbled through about 35 minutes of podcasting. But I'm so glad you're here.
I'm embarrassed. I'm glad I'm here too.
I'm going to give Kevin a little bit of a background of what I've been talking about.
Okay.
So I rehashed last week. I talked about how we kind of that's funny. We talked about the presidential debate.
Yes.
And I talked about how Marianne was saying that in order for us to progress as a nation, we need a moral and spiritual awakening,
yes.
AKA a moral cleansing.
Yes.
And I was discussing what that looks like in politics. Mm-hmm. And I was discussing what that looks like in politics. So, Marianne was talking about how we need to get corporations out of our government policies. And we also need to, the government needs to give us reparations, give black
right.
people affected by slavery reparations.
Yes.
And, basically how that all plays a hand in a lot of the bad that we see right now, because you have the NRA that has their hand in gun laws. Mm-hmm. You have the FDA that has regulations over food and other, agriculture.
Right.
You have the FAA. Mm-hmm. Then you have the EPA.
Yes. We need congressional deregulation, is what she's saying.
Right. And we need to, yes. Yes, that's exactly right. So I was just basically speaking about how, it can start there, and, how these companies are able to do that is through lobbying.
Yes.
And unfortunately, a lot of these companies, they have the funding to lobby millions of dollars. And I explained to the people what lobbying is.
Yes.
And I was just saying that, this is the reason why we have a lack of trust in our government and a lack of trust in our politicians.
Yes.
Because, we know that we have these corporations and these outsiders that are able to go ahead and influence our government policies.
Yes.
And it's like as if we really don't have a say, and the government doesn't care about us.
Right. I don't know if Williamson or Marianne Williamson would call this Nietzschean politics, but I look at this as Nietzschean ethics. Nietzschean ethics calls, if you study Nietzsche, a German philosopher, political analyst, he would call upon self-reflection. That's the simplest way that I can put it. Self-reflection in order to reach the higher person. What does that mean? You look at the past, you look at what happened in the past, you look at what worked, what did not work, you look at it as a means of self-growth. So for example, with the United States, and you're talking about reparations, self-growth or national healing and growth for the United States would be looking back at its past in slavery, Jim Crow, colonialization. So the destruction of land for Native Americans, colonialization of their, obstruction of land and resources, slavery, looking back at its past, confronting what it did, not shoving it away, not covering it up, not saying we need to get over it, but addressing it head on as a means of healing. When you do that, you cause yourself to look at the root causes of where you got to today.
Right. And, I basically said that that's what a moral cleansing is.
Exactly what a moral cleansing is.
It describes behaviors that are aimed at restoring self-worth in response to in response to past transgressions. So righting our wrongs.
Right. The basis of my research was Nietzschean politics, and that he talked about self-worth. He talked about the review of the higher person. He had his critiques of what moralism would look like and reaching perfectionism. But he really delved into self-worth, self-understanding, and basically knowing self. And that's what we've come across. I mean, these companies, such as a great example, since we're talking about moral cleansing and political ethical treatment, human civil rights, you see gentrification, dare I talk about it, happening across the United States.
Yeah, and I also spoke about, the mass shootings.
Yes.
And how you have these young people who are able to just go and acquire guns. Let's talk about, have you seen that video of, I think he was 12 or 14 years old, and he wasn't able to buy porn. He wasn't able to buy a lottery ticket. But he could buy an automatic weapon.
Right.
I mean, not an automatic, but he was able to buy a shotgun or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about that. That's what we need to look at. So Trevor Noah, this is part of my notes. Forgive me, America. I'm a little bit frazzled. My notes and everything gone.
We're both frazzled today there, Kevin.
So I like the quote that Trevor Noah said. A lot of people concerning gun laws and concerning moral cleansing, a lot of people look at the constitutionality or the legality of the situation, but miss the human aspect. So Trevor Noah said, we're not talking about attacking the NRA or completely getting rid of or amending the Second Amendment. But what we're talking about is what can we do policy-wise that could make gun ownership safer.
Yeah, and so a lot of the politicians are talking about universal background checks, and some are talking about licensing all of your weapons.
Yes, a majority of them are.
Yeah, the majority.
And Marion.
Well, actually, it's the reverse. A majority are talking about universal background checks, and you have a select few who are talking about like gun licensing.
Right.
Because my research, I don't know, I'm sorry to cut you off.
No, of course.
Yeah, my research was showing that universal background checks and I forgot what it was. Universal background checks, it was gun licensing, and it was something else.
Yes.
But the background checks and the something else that it's in my notes somewhere. But basically, they're not as effective
Right.
as making sure that you have to have a license for each and every one of your weapons.
Right, because a lot of people get away with not licensing their weapons. A lot
Yeah.
of people can go underground.
That's
and
right.
buy
You can go
unlicensed weapons.
exactly, or
Yeah.
you can just go to these trade shows and purchase a weapon without any questions being asked.
Right.
So if you have to license your weapon, you automatically have to go through a background check because
Right.
you have to be cleared in order to get licensed.
Right,
I mean, think
exactly.
about it. Like well, I don't know about DC, but I know in Maryland, I don't think you can have
You
guns
cannot.
in DC, but I know in Maryland,
Right.
like the licensing is very strict.
It's extremely strict. So before that policy in Maryland, that state policy came into play, a lot of people rushed to these gun shows,
Yeah.
sometimes out of state, to procure the weapons that they needed. Now, I don't want to say it like that, like we were forming a militia, but a lot of us are collectors. Not myself, but a lot of us are collectors.
Right.
They rushed out to some of the shows out of the state of Maryland. Maryland had a few shows out in the county, especially in southern Maryland. They bought everything up because some of the weapons went unlicensed. But with that strict licensing law, it's very strict. We can have them, but they have to be registered, they have to be licensed, and they have to be purposed. What do I mean by that? So let's just say, for instance, and we have an age limit. So let's just say, for instance, I'm 30. I could have bought a gun when I was 21, and we changed that. It used to be 18, now it's 21. Could have bought it either age. I'm 30, so if I wanted to be a collector, I would have to go to a licensed state collector. That means that they have been under scrutiny, vetted very hard. All of their weaponry that they sold, vetted very hard to find out the origin of where they are, of where they're from.
Right.
I would have to go through a strict background check, regardless of whether I have any felonies, regardless of mental health. I would have to go through a strict background check. I would have to take a physical test to show that I am capable of using a gun. I know how to use it.
Right.
I have to go through an actual shooting test to make sure that I knew.
I mean,
what
it's
I'm
the same
doing.
thing with like buying a car.
Exactly.
You have to go through. You have to do first. You do your written test.
You do your written test, then you take lessons.
Then you
to-
take lessons. You
and
have
then
to
you
go.
do-
Yeah.
you
And
do
then
your
you
driving test.
exactly. Exactly.
So in Maryland, you go. I do a background check. Then after the background check, I do a written test and 2 physical tests to show that I know what I'm doing. And then after all is said and done, then I have to do like a purpose. If I'm getting the gun for collection, I have to show that I'm a licensed collector. If I'm getting the gun for hunting, I have to go to hunting classes and show that I am a licensed hunter. I have to purpose why I'm buying the gun. Then I have to go to a licensed dealer, and they go through many, many loops.
So why this is important is because you have the states within the United States that have the most lenient gun laws. They also happen to have the highest rate of gun violence
Yeah,
in per 100,000 people.
yeah, that's very.
You know what I
true.
mean? The
Yeah.
top 10 have the most lenient gun laws,
Right.
and one of them being where.
El Paso, Texas.
Well, I think Texas is one of them,
Texas has,
but
yeah.
I know that Montana.
Yes, has very lenient
Yeah,
gun laws.
Montana.
Texas also has extremely lenient gun laws.
Yeah, and so it was interesting because I think who is it? Not Pete Buttigieg. Yeah, isn't it Pete Buttigieg?
Yes, that's where
From
I got it.
Montana. I think he was for universal background checks, but I don't know if he was about the licensing per se.
I did not read that. A lot of them are for background checks.
Yeah.
Only a few are for licensing.
I can't remember, but I can get back to you get back to you on that.
Yeah.
But
So coming in from the other side, a lot of people would say, well, I mean, what about criminals? Are you able, so let's just say, and no one is saying take away guns. That's not what we're saying.
yeah, but the premise of the purpose of the Second Amendment
Yeah.
was not so that Americans just go out and just
It was to
buy a
form
hope.
It was to help form a militia.
It was to help against war.
War. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it was for the purpose, and I had the exact, again, I apologize, I had the exact words of the amendment with me, America. But the purpose of the Second
That's okay.
Amendment, yes, the purpose of the Second Amendment in the 18th century was a response to what the founders, their grandparents experienced during their time in the British Empire. It was a response in case we have foreign invasion. It was a response in case we have internal invasion. We have the right to form a militia, and that militia has a right to procure the weaponry needed for protection, local protection. Then it was in the 1930s, there were specific laws, and this is also in my notes because I did research on the Second Amendment. There were specific laws that caused for the amendment to be extended, and saying that this right is to be extended beyond military, but to the individual person, so individual citizens. And the federal court reopened those particular cases in both 2008 and 2010. One in D.C. And review of the no gun laws here in D.C. It was under federal review, and then the other in Chicago. And they both cases found that as citizens, we have the right to bear arms in protection against foreign invasion and internal conflict. What that means is, that doesn't mean we get to go out and buy whatever we want. What that means is, under guidelines, we have the right of protection.
Yeah, we have the right to self-protect,
We
right.
have the right of self-protection. So if you have, and Trevor Noah said it perfectly, if you have a right to protect yourself, then why not create policies? Why are we looking so much at gun ownership and not at the people themselves? The Second Amendment was made originally to protect the people, not to protect the procurement of guns, not to protect guns itself, but to protect the people.
And not to protect these large corporations that
who have their hand in government.
have their
for
hand
that
in,
reason.
yeah.
In research, the NRA, they were very against, the Black Panthers in the 1960s taught about self-protection, which is part of the Second Amendment. The NRA was they were advocates in procuring weapons from groups like the Black Panthers.
That's right.
Now they're all of a sudden, they're all for, hey, no, the Second Amendment allows us to sell and bear arms, and you're violently taking that right from U.S. citizens when you put gun restrictions on the Second Amendment. And number one, that's not what the amendment was drafted for. And number two, that's not what's being done. We're just saying add some policies that could aid in the protection of people. Just like how we have policies that would restrict you from driving or using your car in a unfavorable manner that could cause harm, texting and driving, drinking and driving, driving on the opposite side of the road, speeding. Just like we have protection with the travel of airplanes, where we have laws that regulate, who can fly the plane, because a lot of people would use that. Oh, cars, and a lot of people actually do say that cars and planes are dangerous. Are you going to take them away too? No, but we have policies to make them safe.
Yeah, and we have policies to ensure that someone is not going to. But what I'm saying is that we have security measures in place to ensure that no one can, hijack a plane.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. So that's all what you need. You need security measures or policy that could make.
We need policy in order to implement security measures that will
lower.
That will essentially ensure that guns or weapons are being placed in the right hands. Not ensure.
Exactly.
I mean, you can't guarantee. There's no guarantees about anything. But
Right.
when
there's always a black market.
there's always a hole. There's always a loophole.
Right.
But at the end of the day, if we are taking these measures to ensure that we make these loopholes tighter,
we need to try. That's the emphasis that I want to put out.
I mean, I'm just surprised that, I can't imagine what these victims are, these families of these victims are going through right now, because I would be angry with my government.
Yeah.
Because how many
with the conversation that my government is having?
I would be angry with my government, period, because essentially whenever policies are being put to make, for stricter gun laws, we're getting blocked in the Senate. The House is being blocked by the Senate. And it's like, So basically, you're okay with this?
Right. Because they have a lot of constituents in their pocket that are connected to the NRA and small gun businesses.
You know,
But I would then add, with policy comes moral, and this is what I was talking to.
moral leadership.
Moral leadership, moral cleansing. Policy is not enough. And I come from a very spiritual background. I'm coming from a very spiritual background. I don't want to alienate anyone who's not. But to me, there must be a sense of moral cleansing in the spirit. What draws a person to go into a Walmart targeting Latino Americans and shooting them for no particular reason, because in their minds, this is what they're purposed to do. This is what will bring about the Pax Romana of the United States, like this grand, like this grand existence in the U.S. What draws a person to that madness?
Well, here's the thing. We can't answer that question, right? We can't answer what drives a person to do that. We can't say certain things that influence that person. For example, 45 using the words like, the immigrants are invading our country.
Right.
You are essentially talking to people who are hypersensitive and, towards, they're very racist. You know what I'm saying? They're very hypersensitive towards, immigrants coming into this country. And so what you're doing is fueling the fire
By
putting out that kind of rhetoric.
Right.
However, again, that's another thing that we can't control. We can't control what he says. We can't control the media. What we can do is control ourselves.
Right.
And so, moral leadership comes from us picking moral leaders from the grassroots up.
May I present these records that I found? So in the year 2019 thus far, I believe we've had 259 mass shootings. And so in Mexico, and I did small research, Mexico is fueled by cartel power in government. And I emphasize that because, basically the government is being overtaken by criminals. However, in Mexico in 2019, they only had one mass killing. They're not counting, they're not counting various troubles in urban centers like Mexico City. When we define mass shooting, we define shooting or killings.
More.
Yeah, right. On a massive scale.
Right.
We had 259 with a
51, yeah.
51 with a stable government. They only had in 2019 one. And I'm at a loss of words of what that means for our republic. What does that mean for the spirit of our republic?
Well, I think, like I said, I think that we are unable to control that. We are only able to control ourselves. We can't stop these things from happening, but what we can do is
Make it harder for people.
Make it harder for people to have to make these things happen.
Right.
But also, and what I mean by that is that in order to develop trust in politics, we have to develop trust within ourselves.
Right.
And
self-reflection.
Yeah, because if we are voting for the one who is going to give us the biggest tax breaks, or the one who is the most popular, or we're voting according to our race, or we're voting according to the fact that we may get $1,000 a month,
which is a huge mistake.
What we're doing essentially is telling ourselves that we can't be trusted.
Right.
Because we are only voting according to what we want, as opposed to what the overall, the overall purpose is.
Right.
And it's to have a strong, united country.
What you're hitting on the nose is what the founders. I go back to the words of George Washington, and of course I'm paraphrasing.
Speaking to the mic.
Oh, I'm going into the words of George Washington, and of course I'm only paraphrasing. But George Washington spoke against faction loyalty for that particular purpose. Only voting or moving in regards to your particular community can be very dangerous, because you could miss what's appreciated, or you could miss what's necessary for the community at large. So, great example, if you're only voting according to your skin color, you could miss particular policies that could be put in place that could damage a larger community. If you're only voting because you'll get $1,000 in your pocket, number one, you're not considering where that money is going to come from. Money does not grow on trees, and you're putting you're putting risk on the financial needs of a greater community because taxes are raised. How does that look like in the future? How does that look like with your paycheck? How does that look like when you're given $1,000 and then all of a sudden supermarkets and rent and everything else is raised because they know how much you're getting? And do you know what I mean? How much you're getting into your bank account. You said these words when we were talking the other day.
Yeah.
You miss the particular mark
Yes.
when you're only focused on your own particular needs of your own particular community and not the greater community.
Yeah, and so like when I say we have to develop self-trust, it's basically combining our competence with our character.
Exactly.
You know, yes, I can look at a politician or, you know, whatever and vote competently. This person has the most experience. They've been doing this for a long time. They're going to give me the $1,000, the extra $1,000 that I need to pay my rent or whatever. But, you know, what is that saying about my character?
Exactly.
Basically, what I'm saying is that I'm self-serving,
Right.
and I am voting for people who are also self-serving,
Yes, exactly.
and that are toting an agenda, dangling a carrot in front of me instead of allowing me to see the full view.
Right.
You know?
I believe, and people always draw back to Adams in that particular example. Oh, well, Adams designed a system where many people from many different organizations or groups or cultural groups or factions can be represented. I believe that when Adams drew the map for Congress to follow in order for all voices to be heard in Congress, he didn't mean to signal off various communities where you stand up for your rights and you don't think about the rights of others. What he meant is, no, you need to come together. What is concerning for women in America? What is concerning for black people in America? Come together, come up with a list, and see how we can better our situation. But then work in concert with our brothers and sisters across the aisle. That's why. So you represent your voice, but you're also working
for the greater good.
For the greater good of the community.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And, you know, like Marianne said, a moral cleansing is necessary in order for, you know,
Step out of your own needs.
step out of your own
Wants.
your own needs, your own wants,
Yes.
and, you know, really cleanse yourself morally. Our government needs to do that, but unfortunately we can't control our government until we start controlling ourselves. And so,
We make up the government.
right.
We
we elect the government into office, or we don't. You know, sometimes some of these politicians are just, you know, they just go years and years in office because no one is really voting them out.
Right. No one's looking in, no one's paying attention.
Nobody's
to the
paying
situation.
attention to them. And so I just want to end, you know, the conversation on this note with the motive of the week, which is to ask yourself how it is that you are, do you have self-trust? I mean, we know that there's a lack of trust in politics. We know that there's a lack of trust in our government, but how are you contributing to that in your voting habits, but also in your everyday life? Like, how are you exhibiting self-trust? You know, are you on a daily basis combining your competence with your character in all of your dealings in your relationships, with the way that you operate at work, in the way that you handle your financial responsibilities, and you know, really pay attention to how those things may have affected your life until this point, and if there are adjustments that need to be made, what they are, so that you can, you know, basically put yourself in a better position in the future. Again, this is, thank you for listening. This is Tiffany Clark. You got Kevin Lassiter here, and we are the Motive Zone. We'll see you next week.